So we're continuing with the topic of growth. We saw how plants are put together. We saw how cells are differentiated from each other. And this one begins the topic of how plants grow, a little bit more about how those different organs and tissues get put into place. So this one's titled Vegetative Shoot Growth. And we've covered the definitions of these terms. So vegetative, as opposed to reproductive, this is referring to the parts of the plant that are more devoted to structure and photosynthesis. Shoot, we saw that was referring to the above ground portion. And this example here on the slide is the top of a plant that's growing, showing one of the interesting patterns you get in plants as they grow. Some of these are opposite, like this one. So opposite referring to the arrangement of leaves. These are two leaves that are produced right across from each other. And the next leaves that are produced also across from each other, but rotated 90 degrees from the previous leaves. So this patterning, a lot of the patterning we observe in plants, and some of it rather fantastical patterning, has some basis in really tiny cellular decisions, as we'll see. So going back to organs and tissue systems, we've got different types of cells and organs working together. So our different cell types are tissue systems. If you remember, these were the dermal, ground, and vascular systems. And I introduced those kind of thinking about how they work together. So the whole plant is made up of these different types. These are the three main types of cells, systems that work together to achieve different functions. We've got basically the wrapper of the dermal system, the filler of the ground system, and then the water and sugar conduction of the vascular system. So all those working together, placed nicely together. And this slide asks us, how do they complement each other? So meaning how they work together, not the same as how they complement each other, right? So giving someone a compliment is different from complement. This is complement with an E, meaning that they are sort of making up for what the other ones don't have. So the water conducting cells, they can do their job by virtue of the support they get from other parts of the plant. So having the protection of the epidermis and the water and nutrient storage of the ground tissue around them, these all help the vascular cells to have their, to be able to do their function. And then same thing, we can ask how the organs complement each other. So what does a leaf provide to the whole plant? What does it need? What does a leaf need from the stem of the plant? So stem, we're typically thinking about structure for the most part. So structure, also protection. And that structure of the stem that's mostly growing upwards, at least in this example, provides the positioning for where these leaves can grow and get higher up towards the light, have access to light at different positions. So they're all working together. And one of the big complements that we also covered in the last topic was basically how the above ground and below ground parts can complement it with each other. So below ground's gathering the water, that's one of its major jobs in the root system. And then photosynthesis is one of the major jobs of the leaf organ. And both of those jobs need the contribution of the other. So the roots need sugar from photosynthesis and the leaves need water from the roots. So another way to look at that is if you've got cells growing next to each other, how do these cells get what they need? So here we have pith. We didn't really talk about this different set of cell type descriptions. Pith is this central collection of ground or parenchyma cells. So they're just in there, they're filled up with water and capable of nutrient storage, but otherwise not particularly specialized. And that cell, even though it's maybe not actively doing a lot to enable the growth of the plant, it's a living cell that needs its components to stay alive. So a living cell needs some energy. Plants get their energy from photosynthesis. So let's say we're buried in the dark innards of a plant stem right here. This is maybe isolated from the sunlight, and it's not immediately, it doesn't have access to air, it doesn't have immediate access to uh, to its own source of water, to sunlight. So these cells are really dependent on other cells. So if this cell is going to be valuable for the whole organism, then it needs to be able to, it's got to be valuable enough, I guess, to make it worth sustaining that cell. So this job of being filler, nutrient storage, has to get the water that the roots have provided. It needs to get the sugar that the leaves have provided, and then also be able to kind of work together with the cells next to it. So I kind of like to zoom in at the cell level sometimes and think about what an individual cell is doing. What does it give? What does it take from the whole organism? And how all these cells work together. So even the ones that are kind of nondescript still are important to the whole organism function. That's one of the big things I want to convey here. So one of the big, when people ask me what our themes of this class are, one of the big descriptions that I give tend to describe what we cover in this class as plant structure and function. So basically, in general, plants, most specifically the flowering plants, how they're put together and what they do, or how they function. And that's what I talked about when we talked about the different textbooks that I use. We've got some basics of botany, and then sometimes we get into more fine detail of how these things all work. And moving forward, I wanted to introduce some concepts, some vocabulary. These are terms for the different disciplines of studying the aspects. So if you see something in this course that you like and you want to go on and study more of it, these might be your jumping off points. So the first two descriptors here are anatomy and morphology. And anatomy, so I'll just sort of define these and give you an idea of what could be studied in each discipline. Anatomy, the term actually basically refers to something being sliced. So anatomy, if you have something that's an otomy, you get something cut out as part of a surgery, that's, something is cut out. This is a slice for studying. So this is a slice through a developing flower, cross section, and you can see on here the different circles of the cells. We've seen some of these before, the different cell types, tissue types, the epidermal layer, the vascular cells are in there as well. So even though this is a reproductive structure that we haven't really talked about yet, you can see some of the features we've already talked about. So how they're arranged, you got these sometimes very regular shapes. So big triangular kind of pattern going through that has to do with the multiples of 3. So certain flower organs are produced in multiples of 3 here. Moving inwards, you've got the cells that are part of the pollen production in kind of this ring here. And then in the very center, these are cells that are part of the ovule production. So all within a flower, lots of different functions contained there. And the concept of anatomy refers to what the different cells are, what they're doing. So an individual cell in terms of development, you could follow the cells that become pollen grains, and you can follow the cells that become, say, a nectar producing gland or something like that. So it's a really kind of fine scale. You could go at a finer scale than this and look at something more like molecular biology of plants, but that's, for the most part, that's at a level of detail finer than what we're going to look at. Another subject that's kind of related to that is morphology. The origin of the word morphology is morpho for shape. So shape or form, it's basically the study of how organs and larger parts of the plant take on the shape that they have. So it's a little bit more three-dimensional development. So anatomy can tell you about maybe two-dimensional development or individual cells developing. Morphology is a little more focused on the organ or organ systems. So these are developing flowers from a different perspective. They've got a different symmetry. So they've got more of a straight across 1, 2 structures there. These are developing organs at the outside of flowers, and then the arrangement of flowers relative to each other. And the numbers on here showing the order that these organs are initiated. So the IM is the inflorescence meristem. This is the growing tip of this flowering structure. 1 is the most recently produced. That's probably going to go off and become a flower. 2 are older than that. 3 is even older. 4, 5, and so on. So seeing how these organs are initiated, when and where, and seeing sort of how that contributes to the overall structure, we'll get a chance to see a little bit of that as we go through today's topic as well. So anatomy, morphology, and then the third one, sometimes you like to have things in threes. The other discipline that's kind of contained within this course is physiology. And that is more at the level of molecular biology. So molecules, enzymes, pathways, processes, biochemistry, synthesis and breakdown of molecules, and so on. And mostly this is at a level that's a little trickier for us to understand in this course. But this is just an example of some processes of photosynthesis, and in more detail, looking at the enzymes responsible for that, the molecules that they produce, and how those interact with each other. So certainly a very important aspect of plants, but also a little bit at the fringe of what students in this class are, basically what you've been prepared to learn using your prerequisites. I don't know if this one, this subject's a little bit off a little farther than we're ready to cover. All right, so let's zoom back out to a little more comfortable distance and talk just basically about how plants are put together. So we talked about the different cells, we talked about differentiation, and the concept of meristem was mentioned last time. And meristem, I think it's useful to see the word stem in there, and you can basically turn meristem cells into stem cells. They're kind of the cells at the growing and developing tips of the plant. So we have these areas called the apical meristem and shoot apical meristem for the above ground tip of the plant, and the root apical meristem for the below ground tip of the plant. And just a reminder, I think it's tempting to think only about the shoot apex. Apex is kind of tip. Often we think of it as the top, but in plants, the apex also can be the tip of the underground portion. And within those, you can see the different cells as they're put together. These areas here that I've highlighted are the kind of the central cell dividing zone. So if you want to really boil down a plant to where it's growing from, this is really it. It's at these meristem regions. They're small. The cells are smaller because they're actively dividing. And before they've gotten old and well divided, they tend to be pretty small. So farther away from these locations, we move up from the tip of the root, we get longer cells, larger cells that are in the process of differentiating. Same thing for the shoot. But when they're first made, they're rather small and dense, and they tend to show up kind of darkly from the stain that shows up the cell walls. So we kind of talked about how those different cells are formed. You can kind of imagine how a starting set of parenchyma cells in the meristem, some of those get tapped to become ground tissue, some of those get tapped to become vascular tissue, xylem and phloem cells, and some of those get tapped to become dermal cells. On the apex of the shoot, it's like this dome right at the outside of the plant. And in the root, there's a kind of a dome, but it's also protected by this root cap here. We'll see that in a little more detail when we talk about roots. So I skipped over the previous slide. Let's go back to that. So putting those back into context, the shoot apical meristem, we were looking really closely at this in the previous slide, where we were just talking about, and in the roots, that looks pretty similar to what we saw before. So these are what you would see if you zoomed in at the tip of the root and the tip of the shoot. And you can see kind of how that fits in with the bigger parts of the plant. So on a cellular level, these dividing cells become early vascular cells and ground cells and so on. That's on the microscopic level. On the macroscopic level, this little shoot tip here, you can see that it's giving rise to organs. We see the leaves beginning to form near the shoot tip, and the leaves get bigger and older as we get farther away. So as plants are growing, the older parts of the plant are the ones that have been established for longer, and they tend to be farther away from the growing tips of the plant. So big emphasis on the shoot apex and the root apex, but plants don't just grow straight up and straight down. They branch out at the roots, they branch out at the shoot, and we'll see how that works as well. Axillary buds, this is a kind of the beginning of side shoots. So the axil here and the location between the leaf and the stem. So where a leaf meets the stem, that sort of armpit there is called an axil, A-X-I-L. And there's often a bud located there, and there can be, as we see here, side growth from those. So that bud has the potential to grow out into a side shoot with its own stem and leaves.